What would it take for you to leave your home in the middle of the night, in -10-degree weather, with one bag, without your coat, and never come back? That is exactly what happened on a farm in Iowa in December 1906. And the coat was still on the hook 3 days later when the neighbors finally came looking. Welcome to a story that begins, as so many of the darkest ones do, with something missing. Before we go further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because I want you to picture the place you're sitting right now, the warmth around you. And then, imagine what it would feel like to walk away from it forever, without saying goodbye to anyone. Iowa in the winter of 1906 was not a place that forgave carelessness. The land stretched flat and grey in every direction, broken only by the occasional line of bare elms standing like sentinels along frozen creek beds. The farms were spread far apart, each one a small world unto itself, self-sufficient by necessity and isolated by design. Families knew the rhythms of their neighbours as well as they knew their own. The smoke rising from a chimney at 5 in the morning, the sound of an axe splitting wood before dawn, the lamp in the kitchen window that meant someone was already awake and working. These were not details people noticed consciously. They were simply part of the texture of daily life, the way the land breathed around you. Which is why, on a Tuesday morning in the first week of January, when Franklin Marsh rode his horse along the county road between his property and the Carter farm, the absence of smoke stopped him cold. He pulled the reins without thinking. His horse shifted beneath him, breath clouding in the frozen air, and Franklin sat very still for a moment, looking at the farmhouse across the snow-covered field. The sky was the colour of old iron. The temperature had dropped below 0 the night before and showed no sign of recovering. A farm without a fire on a morning like that was not a farm where someone had slept in late. It was something else entirely. Franklin told himself it was nothing. Daniel Carter was a capable man, 38 years old, had been working that land for nearly a decade. He and his wife Emily had no children, which was noted quietly in the community without comment, but they ran a clean, organised operation. Cattle, hogs, a kitchen garden in summer, a small orchard that produced good apples. They attended the Methodist church in the village of Millhaven, 3 miles east. Daniel occasionally drank with other men at the grain exchange, and Emily taught a small, informal reading group for the women on the neighbouring farms every second Saturday. They were, by every visible measure, exactly what they appeared to be. And yet Franklin could not make himself ride on. He dismounted at the fence and walked to the front door. The snow on the porch steps had not been disturbed. Not that morning. Not the morning before. And perhaps not for several mornings before that. He knocked once, and the sound of his knuckles on the wood was swallowed immediately by the silence of the surrounding fields. He knocked again. Nothing. He tried the door, and it swung open without resistance, and the cold that poured out from the dark interior was identical to the cold outside, which meant the fire had been dead for a very long time. Franklin stood in the doorway and looked at the room. His eyes moved slowly across what he saw, the way a man's eyes move when his mind has already understood something his body is not yet willing to accept. The kitchen table had 2 plates on it, both with food that had frozen solid. A cast iron pot sat on the stove, its contents congealed and dark. A chair had been pushed back from the table at an angle that suggested someone had stood up quickly and not bothered to straighten it. Hanging on the hook beside the door was Emily Carter's winter coat. Franklin walked outside, breathing carefully. He stood on the porch for a long moment, looking out at the barn, at the empty sky, at the absolute stillness of the snow. Then he got back on his horse and rode hard for Millhaven. The coat was still on the hook. In weather that had not risen above -10 degrees in 4 days, the coat was still on the hook. Sheriff Edmund Voss of Millhaven was a methodical man who had spent 22 years in law enforcement across 2 counties. He had seen disappearances before, some voluntary, some tragic, most eventually explained. He drove his wagon out to the Carter farm that same afternoon with his deputy, a young man named Carl Hendricks, and spent 3 hours moving through every room and outbuilding with the careful attention of someone who understood that the first examination was the only one that truly mattered. What they found built slowly into something that refused to arrange itself into a simple explanation. In the barn, the animals had been fed within the last 2 to 3 days, judging by the condition of the feed and the water troughs. This meant someone had been on the property more recently than the frozen food on the kitchen table suggested. The wagon was missing from its place beside the barn door. The marks in the snow indicated it had been pulled out at night, given the way the wind had partially smoothed the tracks. 2 sets of boot prints led from the back door of the house to the barn, but only one set returned. The second set simply stopped beside the barn wall and did not continue in any direction, as though whoever made them had been lifted off the ground. In the house, Voss and Hendricks found Daniel Carter's everyday work clothes still hanging on their pegs. His good suit, however, was gone. Emily's winter coat remained on the hook, but her everyday dress and several personal items from the bedroom bureau were missing. The Bible that sat on the nightstand had been moved. Voss picked it up and shook it gently, and an envelope fell out, already opened. The letter inside was written in a woman's careful hand, dated September 1906, 3 months before the disappearance. Voss read it twice, before folding it and placing it in his coat pocket, without showing it to Hendricks. He would read it again that night, by his own lamp, and it would change the direction of everything. The letter was from Emily to her sister in Ohio, a letter that had apparently never been sent. In it, Emily described life on the farm with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned not to say too much on paper. She mentioned the harvest, the weather, the state of her kitchen garden, but near the end of the letter, she wrote something that sat differently than everything else. She wrote that she had been having difficulty sleeping, that she had begun to wake at small sounds in the night, and that on 3 separate occasions in August, she had heard voices from the barn after midnight. Men's voices she did not recognize, speaking in low tones that stopped abruptly whenever she moved in the bedroom above. She wrote that she had asked Daniel about it, and he had told her it was traveling workers looking for shelter, which was common enough on farming roads. She wrote that she had believed him, or at least had tried to. The last line of the letter read, "I think I have been trying very hard not to know something I already know." Voss sat with that sentence for a long time. He began making inquiries the following week. He spoke to the storekeeper in Millhaven, who remembered that Daniel Carter had come in for supplies in late November and paid for a large order entirely in cash, which was unusual. He spoke to the grain merchant, who said that Daniel had been asking questions about rail freight schedules, specifically about which freight lines ran through the county without stopping at official stations. He spoke to a woman from the Methodist Church who said that Emily had seemed distracted at the last 2 services, that her eyes kept going to the doors during the sermon, as though she was watching for something. He also spoke to a farmer named George Alderman, who lived 2 miles north of the Carter property. George had been out checking his fence line on a December evening when he saw 2 riders approach the Carter farm from the direction of the county road. They arrived after dark and left before dawn. He assumed they were relatives visiting for the holidays. He had thought nothing of it until now. He described them as men he had never seen before, riding horses that were better than most farmers in the county could afford, wearing coats that did not look like they had been made in Iowa. Voss returned to the Carter house on his third visit and searched more carefully. Behind a loose stone in the cellar wall, he found what he was looking for. Not a diary, exactly, but a small notebook, the kind sold at general stores for household accounts. Emily had used it for a different purpose. The entries were short, almost telegraphic, written in the same careful hand as the letter. They covered a period of 8 months, from April to December 1906. In April, she wrote that she had found a bill of exchange in Daniel's coat pocket for an amount that made no sense for a farm their size. In June, she wrote that she had overheard Daniel using a name on the road that she had never heard before, a name he gave to a stranger passing through, a name that was not his own. In October, she wrote that she was afraid, but did not know of what exactly. In November, she wrote 4 words and nothing else. The 4 words were, "They came again. Midnight." The last entry, dated December 14th, 9 days before Christmas, contained only a single sentence, written so quickly that the ink had smeared slightly on the right side of the page. "Daniel told me tonight that we may have to leave and that I should not ask why." The lead that broke the stillness of the investigation came not from the county, but from a railroad worker named Albert Pryor, who had been laid up with a lung infection since October and had only just begun moving around again in late January, when the story of the missing Carters reached him through a neighbor. Albert walked into Voss's office on a grey Thursday afternoon and sat down across from the sheriff and told him what he had seen. On the night of December 20th, Albert had been working a late maintenance check on a stretch of secondary track that ran through the bottomland west of Millhaven. It was a miserable night, temperature below 0, wind coming hard off the river. He was moving along the track bed with his lantern when he saw a wagon stopped in a shallow cut between 2 fields, pulled off the road and positioned close to the tree line, as if someone was trying to keep it from being visible from any direction. There were 3 people in and around the wagon. A man he took to be in his late 30s, restless and watchful. A woman seated in the wagon bed, still and wrapped in blankets. And a younger man, perhaps 25, standing at the horses' heads and keeping them quiet. Albert had considered approaching to ask if they needed help, but something in the body language of the older man stopped him. The way he moved, the way his eyes went immediately to Albert's lantern and then tracked it without looking away until Albert had passed well down the line. When Albert came back the same way 40 minutes later, the wagon was gone, and there was nothing in the cut but tire tracks and the prints of horses in the snow. Voss had the description of that scene, and he moved on it fast. He sent a telegram to the sheriff in Council Bluffs the same afternoon. He sent another to the marshal in Omaha. He contacted the station agent at every rail stop within 50 miles and asked about a couple traveling with a younger man, traveling light, paying cash, not drawing attention to themselves. The responses came back over the following week, and they formed a trail. A couple matching the description had been seen at a boarding house in Red Oak, 40 miles southwest, staying 2 nights in late December. The woman had barely spoken. The man had paid for both rooms in advance and been awake before dawn both mornings. They had left, heading west. From Red Oak, the trail led to a small town called Hastings in Nebraska, where the innkeeper remembered the same couple because the woman had asked him quietly, while the man was outside with the horses, whether the next eastbound train stopped there. The innkeeper had said yes, and had noticed that she seemed to relax very slightly at this information, though the relaxation left her face entirely when the man came back inside. In Hastings, there was also mention of the younger companion, who had stayed separately in a rooming house near the stockyards and had departed without paying his final night's rent. Voss was building a picture, and the picture was not of two people running away together. It was of a woman being moved. He pushed his investigation harder. Short sentences, no wasted motion. He found a livery operator in Hastings who had seen Daniel Carter arguing with the younger man behind the stable. Voices low, but sharp. The younger man shaking his head and pointing south, while Daniel's hand kept going to his coat pocket, in the way men's hands move when they're thinking about money or weapons, and can't decide which one they need. The livery operator didn't know what they were arguing about. He had gone back inside. But he remembered it because the woman had been standing 6 feet away, watching the argument, with an expression he described as someone who has already accepted the worst possible outcome and is simply waiting for it to arrive. Then the younger man disappeared entirely from the trail. He was there in Hastings, and then he was not. No forwarding address, no ticket purchase, no further sighting. Daniel and Emily Carter continued south and west alone. It was a river town in Missouri called Booneville where everything finally surfaced. A woman had been found sitting on the riverbank in late February, coatless in 30-degree weather, staring at the Missouri as if waiting for it to tell her something. A local doctor named Hargrove had been called and had taken her to his office and spent 3 days trying to get coherent speech from her. When she finally gave her name, Hargrove sent a telegram to Millhaven, and Edmund Voss made the 3-day journey south. He found Emily Carter in a small room above Hargrove's office, sitting upright in a chair by the window, watching the street below, with eyes that were present, but very carefully not attached to anything. She was thin, in a way that suggested weeks of inadequate food. Her hands, resting on her knees, had a faint, continuous tremor that the doctor said had been there since she arrived. But when Voss said her name and mentioned Millhaven and the farm and the name of her neighbor, Franklin Marsh, something moved behind her eyes, the way a lamp catches when someone brings a match close enough. And then she was looking at him directly, and her voice, when it came, was low but clear. She said, "I need to know if you're going to make me go back there." He told her there was nothing to go back to. The farm was empty. She had been found. That was all that mattered now. She began to talk. She told him about the months before the disappearance, with the precision of someone who had been replaying events in her own mind for long enough that the details had worn themselves smooth. The night visitors had begun in spring. 2 men she had never been introduced to, who arrived after dark and left before light, and whose voices she could hear through the bedroom floor, low and continuous, like water moving under ice. Daniel had told her they were business associates, that he was working on an arrangement that would improve their situation significantly. When she had asked what arrangement, he had said it was complicated, and changed the subject with the deliberate calm of a man who has rehearsed the deflection. She had let it go the first time. She had let it go the second time. By the third time, she had stopped asking and started watching. She had found the bill of exchange in his coat pocket in April. She had found a letter in June, partially burned in the outdoor fireplace, that mentioned a name she did not know and a shipment she could not identify. She had begun to understand, in the quiet, methodical way that intelligent people understand things they do not want to understand, that her husband was moving goods he had no legal right to move, and doing business with people who solved disagreements through means that had nothing to do with courts or sheriffs. She told Voss about the argument in December. It had happened at the kitchen table after supper, with the lamp between them and the wind working itself against the windows outside. She had placed the partially burned letter on the table between them and asked him directly what it meant. There had been a long silence. Daniel had looked at the letter, and then at her, and then at the lamp flame, and she had watched his face go through several things in sequence: calculation, something close to shame, and finally, a kind of tired resignation that frightened her more than anger would have. He had told her then, "Not everything, but enough." He was in debt to men he could not refuse. He had taken payment for work he had not been able to complete. There were people coming to collect, and what they intended to collect was not money. She told Voss that the night they left, December 20th, Daniel had shaken her awake at 11 and told her to dress and bring only what she could carry in one bag, that she should leave her coat because it was too recognizable, that there was a man waiting with a wagon, and that they needed to be 3 miles from the farm before midnight. She had asked him where they were going, and he had said, "Away from here," and she had understood that was the only answer he had. The younger man with the wagon was named Calvin, or that was what Daniel called him. Emily never knew his last name. He was quiet and cooperative in the way of someone doing a job for pay, not a friend, but a hired hand for the escape. He had driven them southwest through the night and connected them to a freight arrangement that moved them further along, stopping and starting across Nebraska and into Missouri over the course of 2 months. They had slept in barns, in cheap rooms, in one instance, in the back of a carpenter's workshop, whose owner Daniel apparently knew from some previous chapter of his life that Emily had not been aware of. Calvin had disappeared in Hastings after an argument she had not fully heard, but partly understood. He had told Daniel that he had done what he was paid to do, and that what came next was not his concern. Daniel had tried to give him more money, and Calvin had refused it, which told Emily that what came next was something Calvin wanted no part of, regardless of payment. After that, it was only the two of them, and Daniel's paranoia intensified with each mile, each new town, each stranger who held his gaze a moment too long. She told Voss about the last night in Boonville, and her voice dropped to something that was barely above a whisper. Daniel had been out since afternoon, saying he was looking into passage on a riverboat going south. He had not come back by nightfall. He had not come back by midnight. By morning, she had sat with the knowledge for long enough that she no longer needed to wait to be certain. She described what it felt like to realize that the person who had been the entire world of your daily life, flawed and frightening as that world had become, was simply not going to return. She said it felt less like grief and more like a room with no walls, nothing to push against in any direction. She had walked to the river and sat down, and that is where the doctor had found her. Voss spent 2 weeks in Boonville and along the Missouri River corridor, asking questions with the patience of a man who knows he is working the last section of a long road. He spoke to riverboat captains and dock workers and the operators of the establishments that served men who moved goods along the water. He spoke to a former marshal named Cutler, who had retired to a house above the floodline and who knew the criminal geography of the river counties better than anyone still drawing a salary. Cutler told him about a man named Rourke, who operated out of St. Louis and controlled a significant portion of the illegal freight moving through the river corridor between Missouri and Iowa. Not a man who appeared in public records or who could be identified in a photograph, but a name that came up reliably in the same way that weather came up, constantly, inescapably, and always as an explanation for things going wrong. Rourke dealt in stolen goods, illegal spirits, and the kind of financial arrangements that moved money between desperate farmers and patient criminals. He employed men throughout the river towns to identify farms with debt problems, farms where the operator might be persuaded or pressured into allowing their property to serve as a waypoint for goods moving north. He was the kind of organization that looked for people already at the edge of collapse and applied just enough pressure to tip them over into usefulness. This, Cutler said, was almost certainly what had happened to Daniel Carter. Voss found a dock worker in Boonville who remembered seeing Daniel on the evening of his disappearance. A man matching the description had been on the waterfront near the South Dock around 6 in the evening, talking to 2 men the dock worker did not recognize. The conversation had been short. The 2 men had done most of the talking. Daniel had listened with the stillness of someone who has run out of arguments. The dock worker had not seen him again after that evening. The 2 men had left in the direction of a warehouse district near the rail yard and had not returned to the waterfront that night. Voss also found a woman who ran a small boarding house near the South Dock who told him that a man had come to her door 2 days after the incident, asking questions about a couple who had recently been staying in the area. This man had been polite, but in the way that carries a clear message beneath the politeness. The way a closed door is polite, when what it is really doing is stopping you from entering. He had asked whether the woman, meaning Emily, had gone north or south. The boarding house keeper had said she didn't know, which was the truth. The man had thanked her and left. He had arrived on horseback and ridden north. Voss considered this for a long time. He went back to Emily with what he had learned and told her, as directly as he could manage, that Daniel was almost certainly dead, that the men who had pursued him across 2 states had the means and the motivation and the opportunity, and that the river, as it always did in such situations, had accepted what was offered and said nothing. Emily listened without expression. When he finished, she asked only one question. She asked whether those men knew where she was now. Voss told her he did not know. She nodded once, slowly, and looked back out the window at the Missouri. The formal investigation wound down, as investigations do when the central figure is presumed dead and the evidence is scattered across 3 states and several bodies of water. Voss filed his reports, maintained his correspondence with marshals along the river corridor, and eventually returned to Millhaven with Emily Carter in the spring of 1907. She had recovered enough physically to travel, though recovery is perhaps too clean a word for the particular way she had managed to reattach herself to the practice of daily living. She did not return to the farm. The property had been seized against unpaid debts and sold to a family from Wisconsin who arrived with children and energy and no knowledge of what the land had held before them. Emily took a room above the dry goods store in Millhaven, and within 6 months had established herself as a teacher, first informally with the children of neighboring farms, and eventually as a full-time instructor at the county school that had lost its teacher to marriage the previous autumn. She was, by every account, exceptionally good at the work. She had a quality that the children responded to, a kind of serious attention to each of them individually, as though she understood from personal experience that small people living in isolated places needed to be seen clearly by at least one other person. Voss kept his files open and continued to monitor developments along the Missouri and Mississippi corridors. In the autumn of 1908, a body was recovered from the Missouri River south of Kansas City in a condition that made identification difficult, but not impossible. Among the items found near the body was a pocket watch with an engraving on the back, the letters D.C., and a date that corresponded to a wedding anniversary. Voss travelled south to examine it himself. He came back without certainty, but with a conviction that settled into him like cold water and stayed there. He told Emily in a quiet conversation in her schoolroom after the children had gone home for the day. She sat very still while he talked. The late afternoon light came through the west-facing windows and lay in long stripes across the floor between them. When he finished, she was quiet for a full minute, and then she thanked him, which was not what he had expected, and explained that she had known for a long time that there is a particular kind of knowing that the body arrives at before the mind will allow it, and that she had been living with that knowledge since the morning she had sat down on the riverbank in Boonville and waited for a man she already understood was not coming back. In 1909, Voss received information through a contact in St. Louis that the man known as Rourke had been arrested in connection with an unrelated matter and was awaiting trial. The arrest had caused significant disruption in the criminal network along the river corridor. Several of his associates had scattered. The operation that had reached into Iowa farmland and pulled Daniel Carter down into it had, at least for the moment, collapsed. This information did not undo anything, but Voss wrote it in his file and underlined it once, and felt, for the first time in 3 years, that the weight of the case had shifted slightly. Emily Carter married a widowed physician named Thomas Alden in 1911. He had come to Millhaven the previous year to establish a practice and had met Emily at a community gathering where she was arguing, with considerable precision, that the county needed to fund a proper school library. Thomas had stood nearby and listened, and found himself entirely unwilling to introduce himself until he could think of something worth saying. They were married quietly in the Methodist church in April of that year, and the community, which had watched Emily's solitary persistence for 4 years with a mixture of sympathy and respect, felt something collectively release. Voss attended the wedding and sat near the back and was glad of everything he saw. He kept the pocket watch. It was not evidence of anything provable. It was simply the last physical object that could be said with reasonable confidence to have belonged to Daniel Carter. And it seemed wrong to let it disappear into an evidence box. He kept it in his desk drawer, and occasionally, on quiet evenings when the office was empty and the town was still, he would take it out and turn it in his hands, and think about the choices a man makes that he does not realize are permanent until it is much too late to unmake them. The files he had compiled were organized and deposited in the county record office in 1918, when Voss retired. He had written a covering note explaining the contents and requesting that they remain sealed for 30 years to protect those still living who had been touched by the events within. When the files were opened in the late 1940s, Emily Alden had been dead for 2 years, having passed peacefully at 71, surrounded by her husband and the children of neighbors she had taught for decades. Among those who examined the documents was a local historian who wrote a careful account of the case for the County Historical Journal. He noted that what made the case remarkable was not its violence or its drama, though it contained both, but its portrait of ordinary rural life concealing extraordinary darkness. The farms of the Midwest, he wrote, were not the innocent places the national mythology preferred to imagine. They were places where desperate people made terrible bargains, and where the consequences of those bargains arrived eventually, as consequences always do, in the cold and the dark. If you have made it this far with us, through the frozen Iowa fields and the river towns and the long silence that followed, then you already know that this is not the kind of story that lets you go easily. These are the cases that stay with you, that surface unexpectedly on a quiet evening when the wind is working against your windows and the room feels smaller than it did a moment ago. There are more of them waiting. Archives full of names and dates and details that have not been spoken aloud in decades. Cases from forgotten counties and river crossings and empty farmhouses that still hold questions no one has thought to ask again. If that is something you want to keep exploring, this is the place to do it. Subscribe and we will keep going together. The county school where Emily had taught was renamed in 1952. Most of the people who attended the renaming ceremony knew her story in its broad outlines: the disappearance, the recovery, the years of quiet determination. Few knew the particular detail that Voss had recorded in his final case notes, and that the historian had thought too unsettling to include in his published account. The two men who had arrived in Millhaven asking questions about Daniel Carter in February of 1907, the same two men who the Boonville boarding house keeper had described, had ridden north from Boonville. They had traveled north through Missouri and across the Iowa border, and had made inquiries in 2 counties before eventually turning back. They had come within 11 miles of Millhaven, within 11 miles of the dry goods store where Emily was sleeping in a small room above the street, unaware, beginning the slow work of becoming someone who could live with what had happened. 11 miles. Voss had discovered this only after the fact, through correspondence with a county deputy in southern Iowa who had found the inquiry records from that period. He had read it at his desk on a winter morning in 1909 and had sat with it for a long time before placing it carefully in the file and writing nothing in response. He had never told Emily. But someone had, eventually, because when the historian spoke to several elderly residents of Millhaven while researching the case, one woman who had known Emily well mentioned that in the last year of her life, Emily had said something that the woman had not fully understood at the time. Emily had said that she had learned, late, and from a source she would not name, that the men who took Daniel had once come looking for her, too, and had stopped, and she had never understood why they had stopped, and that this question, more than any other, was the one she had carried longest. The woman who recounted this paused, and then added that Emily had said it without particular distress, in the tone of someone describing an old scar they have largely stopped noticing. And then Emily had picked up her tea and changed the subject, and never mentioned it again. That question has no answer in the historical record. The files contain no explanation for why the men stopped when they did, so close, and turned back. Whatever calculation they made, whatever decision was reached on a cold road 11 miles from the town where Emily Carter was sleeping, it was never written down by anyone who survived to testify to it. The Missouri still runs where it always has. The farms of southern Iowa still stretch flat and silent under winter skies. And somewhere in the county record office, in a file that has been digitized now and is available to any researcher who knows to ask for it, there was a pocket watch, photographed in black and white, lying on a wooden surface beside a paper evidence tag. The engraving on the back is just legible in the photograph. D.C. April 14th, 1898. The wedding date. The question Emily carried is still unanswered. And that is where I want to leave it with you. Not wrapped up, not resolved, because some cases do not resolve, and pretending otherwise would be a disservice to the people who lived inside them. What I want to know is what you think happened on that road. Why did those men turn back when they were 11 miles away from the woman they were looking for? What stopped them? Leave your answer in the comments. And if someone else has already written something that changes the way you see it, respond to them. These conversations are the best part of what we do here, and the people who follow this channel consistently produce theories that are more careful and more unsettling than anything I could arrive at alone. The comment section on this one is going to be worth reading. I am certain of that. The river has never explained itself, but maybe, between all of us, we can get a little closer to understanding what it knows.